Hello and welcome back to Jo's Art History podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical with me, your host, and your resident art historian, Jo McLaughlin. It's episode 47, and on today's episode, it's just going to be me talking to you today, and I'm going to be discussing my experience when I visited the, quite frankly, brilliantly wonderful and magical Barbara Hepworth Museum and Garden in St Ives, which I was lucky enough to visit in August 2021. Now, the trip for me was a little bit of a pilgrimage / a very belated 30th birthday present to myself. Hepworth for me is not only a fabulous sculptor, but she is somebody who completely carved her own niche in an industry that was completely male dominated in the 1900s. And for me to reach the sort of dizzy heights of fame that she did as a female sculptor was just incredible. And some of you might get annoyed by the fact that I'm referring to her as a female sculptor. She is an artist in her own right, of course, but for me she's just somebody who knew what she wanted and she went after it full force, and I completely admire her for that, as well as being unbelievably talented. So I'm going to give you a quick whistle-stop tour of who Barbara Hepworth is, why she moved to her beautiful studio in St Ives and what happened when she was there, her death and her legacy, the estate and what happened after she died, how I found my visit to the museum and sculpture garden, and if I would recommend it. Spoiler alert, I 100% would. So sit back and relax as I discuss with you today Barbara Hepworth's Museum and Sculpture Garden in St Ives, Cornwall in the UK. So I believe the very best place to start is, of course, the very beginning. So Barbara Hepworth was born in 1903 in a town called Wakefield in England. She was the daughter of a civil engineer and was awarded a scholarship to study at Leeds School of Art from 1920 onwards. Now, Leeds at this point in time, sort of 1920s, 1930s, is a complete thriving hub of artists and a lot of very interesting people who are now complete superstars within the terms of art history and the art world seem to come from Yorkshire, which is the little pocket of England that Leeds is based within. So when she was at art school in Leeds, this is where she met her fellow Yorkshireman and also soon to be completely superstar sculptor Henry Moore, and they became very good friends and established not only a friendship that lasted a lifetime but a rivalry as well. After studying at Leeds, Hepworth successfully won a county scholarship to attend the Royal College of Art in London, which is an extremely prestigious art school even to this day, and she studied there from 1921 and was awarded her diploma in 1924. Once she'd finished studying, she actually won a travel scholarship and was also the runner-up for the Prix de Rome, which is a very, very prestigious art prize and that's awarded to sculptors and painters, and it allows you to go to Rome to study under a master artist. She was the runner-up to a sculptor called John Skeeping, who won that year, and she travelled with him to Siena and Rome, and they obviously got on very well because in 1925 the two of them actually married in Florence, and Hepworth learned how to carve marble from a sculptor, Giovanni Ardini, while she was out in Italy. The couple returned to London in 1926, where they exhibited their works together from their flat, and they had a son together in 1929. Now, this wasn't a happy ending for Hepworth, however. In 1931, Hepworth met and fell in love with an abstract painter called Ben Nicholson, and Ben Nicholson went on to be one of Barbara's greatest inspirations and supporters, and they very much influence each other. If you ever see works of Ben Nicholson or have a Google and compare them, sort of Hepworth to Nicholson, their work is at times very difficult to tell apart. In my opinion, their works on paper, like I said, Barbara was a sculptor, but she was also a fabulous drafts person. Oh my goodness, her drawings are unbelievably incredible. And Ben Nicholson as well. I don't think he dabbled in sculpture, although I could be wrong there. So she met and fell in love with Ben Nicholson in 1931 and divorced Skeeping a year later. Now, at this point in her career, Hepworth was very figurative and was sort of leaning more and more into abstraction, which was very characteristic of her friend, rival and fellow sculptor Henry Moore. it was after a trip to France in 1933 when she met people like Brancusi, Picasso, Jean Arp, that she came home and started really pushing the boundaries of what she did. Now, why Hepworth is somebody who is so important and her work is so fascinating is that she championed traditional making methods. So she wasn't using all these electric tools and carving equipments which were coming onto the market that other sculptors were using. For her, she wanted to be as true as possible to the materials, and instead of using these sorts of things, she would use a very traditional and slightly bohemian. When you think of an artist in their studio, you kind of think of them chiseling away at a block of marble, which isn't normally what happens particularly anymore. There's lots of different tools and things that can help artists along, but very much for Hepworth, that is exactly what she did. And in her studio in St Ives, you can see all her tools that have been laid out, and it's just so beautiful to see how she used her works. Anyway, so in 1939, on the outbreak of World War II, Nicholson and Hepworth decided to relocate to a small fishing village in Cornwall called St Ives. And there was already a little bit of buzz around St Ives because there seemed to be this bubbling community of creatives which had kind of accidentally found their way down there. And even now, when you visit St Ives, it's full of galleries, it's full of artists, and it's a really beautiful, interesting place to be. So Hepworth and Nicholson had 3 children, and they moved to St Ives, as I said, on the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Now, the couple lived there for 10 years, and they lived and worked sort of side by side. And Hepworth, as I said previously, she was very much starting to experiment with lots of different materials. Like I said, she'd started carving in marble, carving in stone, and she was also a fabulous draftswoman. Her drawings are just incredible. And in 1944, one of her children got very, very sick and was taken into hospital. And because she was visiting so frequently, she struck up a friendship with one of the surgeons. And the surgeons actually invited Hepworth in to draw what happens in a hospital, to depict the surgeries and the surgeons. And she has this beautiful series of medical drawings. And it's really interesting because Henry Moore did something similar during World War II as well. He was actually commissioned by the British government to go in and draw people in evacuation shelters when they were using the London Underground as shelters from the Blitz, but also medical drawings as well. So it's a very interesting time in terms of British creativity and what's going on in the art world and the creative industries. Everything had kind of come to a standstill in terms of a market and things like that, because obviously everyone's effort was concentrated on the war, but there was still this outpour from Hepworth and all these different avenues. And actually, there's the Imperial War Museum in London has a fabulous collection of artists who were commissioned during the war, and the British government were really great at commissioning artists to document what was happening. And I'm quite interested potentially in doing an episode about that. Laura Knight is somebody who, particularly after the war, during and after the war, did a series of women at work. Obviously, when the men went out to fight, women had to go into the factories, and these paintings are just incredible. And she went out to Nuremberg to document the Nuremberg trials and has a very sort of abstract, almost surrealist, outer body series of drawings and paintings that she made when she was out there documenting these trials and listening to all the horrendous things that these Nazi generals had done. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit about that and Laura Knight's practice, and indeed the British Council and the British government commissioning artists during World War II to document, let me know, because that might be an episode for season 3. Anyway, back to Hepworth. So she was experimenting in lots of different things, and as I've said previously, she had been living there 10 years, and so I believe the studio is pronounced the Trewin Studios, and if I have that wrong, I do apologise, but the Trewin Studios she came across in 1949 and immediately began to work there. And it also became her place of permanent residence from 1950 onwards until her death in 1975. She had quite a packed life, I must say. She's a very, very interesting artist. And that's kind of how she ended up in St Ives from the war, completely fell in love with the community and saw and found real inspiration from the very sort of cragged landscape in and around the coasts of Cornwall. And if you've ever been, or if you haven't been, I would say have a Google. It's very rocky. The sea is so turbulent, but also in the summer it has these unbelievable tropical blues and greens in the sea that it almost kind of looks like you can see to the bottom, which is just so unbelievably stunning. And for all those listening in the UK, it was kind of the most, in sort of 2020 and 2021, it was the most sort of sought after place of destination for a summer holiday, was St Ives or Cornwall, because it's just so beautiful. But it was really lovely when I visited to see and walk the landscape that she had, and I could really see the stones that had inspired her, and the sort of jagged cliff tops and sudden drops into the ocean that seemed to just go on forever and ever. It was a beautiful, beautiful place. So why is this studio so important? Well, it's really where her practice very much catapulted, and she was very well known by this point in 1949 when she acquired the studio, but it was in here that she started getting and gaining international commissions. One of the most famous commissions, and one of her most important public commissions, which happened later on in life in the 1960s, so I think it's 1961 to 1963, she was commissioned by John Lewis to produce a sculpture for their flagship store in Oxford Street. And it's still there today. So the figure is 6 meters high and was built, constructed, and then sent from her studio. And there's some fabulous images which I will try and find and insert them in my highlights reel on Instagram, or if you're watching this on YouTube right now, you'll be able to see them now, of her building this and then trying to get it out of the tiny little streets of this town. Now, St Ives is a fishing village. Not so much anymore. It's more of a tourist destination now. But for me, why I wanted to go to St Ives, it seemed to be the crux of so much creativity and the epicenter that sort of fired off some fabulous artists such as Terry Frost and Brian O'Casey, who is probably one of my favourite sculptors and artists ever. If you've never heard of Brian O'Casey, son of Sean O'Casey, the playwright, and was actually one of Hepworth's studio assistants along with Terry Frost. So there's a lot of similarities in terms of shape and form for some of the things, and then later on in life, Brian kind of just became his own amazing person. Anyway, so this studio is so important in terms of her creativity, the things that happened to her through her life there. She completely fell in love with the community of St Ives, and actually when you walk around St Ives there is quite a lot of her sculpture publicly displayed. And upon her death, it was Hepworth's wish that her studio be turned into a museum for people to come and experience and walk through and see how she lived and worked. But yeah, she was incredibly inspired by her surroundings in St Ives, the coastal jagginess, the temperament of the sea, the ever-changing landscape in the sky throughout the seasons, and it really spoke to her and her beautiful forms that she made. It was in this studio as well that Hepworth produced some of her best known works. So in 1950, works by Hepworth were exhibited at the British Pavilion at the 25th Venice Biennale, and that was actually the last year that a contemporary artist was shown alongside historical artists. She showed her works alongside artists such as Matthew Smith and John Constable. And the two works that were commissioned, Contrapostal Forms and Turning Forms, were then exhibited a year later at the Festival of Britain in 1951. Again, Henry Moore was commissioned to make something for the Festival of Britain in 1951, and that there was a documentary made on what Moore was making, and it was the first time, fun fact, that an art programme was produced and shown on television. So there you are. Now, as I said, in 1951, Nicholson and Hepworth divorced, and she moved to working solely in her studio. And her studio is so unassuming. So when I went to visit it, I arrived really early on a bank holiday weekend in August. It was 35 degrees, and it was white beaches and beautiful sort of turquoise blue waters. And I got there at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the beach was already full of people. It's like a really sort of hotspot destination for people, and it's essentially what it's turned into is a bit of a holiday town now. I don't think there's very much fishing done, but it is full of galleries and artists and lots of interesting people. There's also a Tate in St Ives as well, very much sort of tucked round at the back And it's a beautiful, beautiful little town, but it just seemed so busy for the time of year, and it really kind of feels that you're on top of each other when you're in there. I'm sure that wasn't the case when Hepworth lived down there. But anyways, she had acquired this space, and you would really, it's so interesting because the main street, she's like one street back from the main shopping street that runs through St Ives. And the Tate since 1980 has run the studio. And when you walk in, I was really, I don't know, I think I'd built it up in my head because she's such a monumentally huge artist. Her works are so important. As a sculptor, I find her so fascinating and her work so beautiful. And when I found where her studio was, it was just almost a bit of a letdown because it was so simple. And she was very well off during her lifetime. She wasn't in any terms, by the point she got to in the sort of 60s and 70s, she wasn't by no means a starving artist. She was incredibly successful, and she had done international commissions with like the UN and things like that. Just a really interesting person. And I got there, and the wall, like her house and studio, is just essentially 3 or 4 rooms. So you go in through this tiny little door at the side of a building, and building's all whitewashed, and you go inside, and the inside is also whitewashed. And essentially what they've done is they've put a little cabinet in the first room, which is really not too big at all. There's a desk where, you know, if you've got any questions, they'll happily answer, and there's like a few shelves of books, but everything out with that is a cabinet that sort of chronologically walks you through Hepworth's life. And I was so underwhelmed when I walked through, and I think it's because I assumed that because she's so famous and she was so well known, that her studio would be really, really flashy. And it made me actually respect her even more because she really championed simple living. It's not like today where everyone's like, you know, you see Damien Hirst or Jeff Koons and it's all bold and flashy. It was really, really simple. And it completely made sense once I sort of moved through the space more, but I was very sort of underwhelmed when I got there, and I was like, oh, but it was fabulous to see like family photos. She was also awarded a damehood in the 60s, so she's actually Dame Barbara Hepworth, which is an incredible achievement. There was the front cover when she was on the New York Times and Times Magazine, all these different amazing international publications where people had flown into St Ives to meet and see this artist and understand what makes her tick and why the landscape around her was so, so important. Really, really beautiful. So it was a couple of sort of things where you sort of moved around her life chronologically, and then you moved up these tiny little stone steps, and it opened up into what was a living area. And what Barbara did in her studio is she sectioned off lots of different bits of it. So you have the 2 rooms, and at the corner of the room at the bottom was a little carving studio where she used to work in wood. And she didn't start working in wood until the late 50s. And it was after a trip to Greece in 1954 that she came home and someone had sent her Nigerian Garia hardwood, which was this huge, huge tree trunk which came into the little docks that are further down in Cornwall in a place called Tilbury. And even though she was only sent 1 tree trunk, it came in at 17 tons. And it was delivered to her, which I just find so interesting. And between 1954 and 1956, she sculpted 6 pieces from the wood. And Barbara does this beautiful thing when she's working with these sculptures where she sort of, it's almost like she's stringing up an instrument. She runs these beautiful thin lines from string from one part to another. They're just so incredibly beautiful and tactile and very sensual in some ways. I find that a lot about Barbara's work. You just kind of want to touch her work. But anyway, why I'm saying this is talking about the carving studio in the bottom floor and up the stairs that I had sort of moved through. And this was all during COVID, so there was a one-way system, but it completely made sense. So you went up and then you kind of went into this, what would be another studio space, perhaps where she would sleep and eat. It was just filled with beautiful sculptures by Hepworth. So some marble works, some woodworks, some wall works, some very experimental abstraction pieces. And it was just a really lovely space. But again, it was so plain. Like there was next to nothing on the walls. There was a mantelpiece that had a couple of smaller pieces from her. And that was really it. The works were nice, but I was kind of like, I don't understand what the big fuss is about. And then I turned and saw the entrance to the garden. And once I sort of moved through into the garden, I completely understood why. Now, Hepworth is someone who when she found this space, she was like, this is perfect. This is a great place for me to live and work and show off my sculpture and what I can do. And she created this beautiful, tranquil garden, which when I was in was just so quiet. And the contrast from leaving the busy street that I had into this very plain space and then coming through into the garden, it completely made sense why this place is so, so special and is very much a pilgrimage for a lot of art historians and a lot of Hepworth fans. It's the most tranquil, beautiful gardens, all these different species of plants and flowers, and scattered in and amongst all this incredible greenery is just the most beautiful selection of Hepworth sculptures which she had curated, and the garden is very much left as Hepworth had the night she died, and she actually died in the studio, but we'll get on to that later. And bronze was actually something that Hepworth didn't really work in until the 60s, I believe. And I think it just shows you that when you have a 20-30 year career behind you and you're still excited about trying new materials and developing new things, I think it just shows you that as an artist, as most artists are, they're curious and they're always looking to develop their practice. So for me, it was just amazing to see, and it really brought her to life. And I really just couldn't help, like I said previously, it was such a quiet, tranquil space. I just kind of thought, but this wouldn't be right because there would be workers here, there would be people sort of chiseling and hammering away on lots of different sort of stones and marbles. And like I said previously, she very much sectioned off her house into different parts. So if you wanted to work in wood, she would have a part of her house where she would go and work in wood. If she wanted to work in marble, she had a marble part of her garden. And actually what's very interesting is there's lots of different columns of marble that are lined up and very much ready to be worked on that have just been left there since she died. And it's very, how it's done, it's very like she's just popped out to the shops and she'll be back any minute to sort of work on things. But they've done this really beautiful thing where in the marble workshop or the marble part of the studio, they have these big columns which have been obviously left waiting for her to come back and do, and they've started to, you know, change over time a little bit. They're out in the open elements, and it's just a really beautiful tribute to the materials in themselves. You can sort of peek through into this sort of glass fronted warehouse where the workshop, her marble workshop, was, and you can see the workers and her studio assistants' coats sort of hanging up. And that's one thing about Hepworth, is she had studio assistants and quite a lot of them. And I do know somebody that knew her studio assistants, and I know I said previously that she didn't ever use power tools, but I've heard through the grapevine that her studio assistants, whenever she left to go do something, they would bring power tools in and work on it. So that's a little bit of insider knowledge. And this is somebody that I worked with previously, who's worked with some of the artists that were Hepworth studio assistants and had lots of stories to tell. And apparently she was a very, very difficult taskmaster. And again, this is really important to remember, sculpture, very, very, very male dominated industry. And here she was in this tiny little town in Cornwall, creating this international empire of these beautiful works, which now go for millions and millions of pounds. But she was incredibly generous to the people of St Ives, as I said. They welcomed her into the community as she did them. And she was very supportive, giving people placements within her studio and also donating works to St Ives. Her son, Paul, from her first marriage, tragically died while he was serving in the Royal Air Force, and she donated a sculpture to the church in St Ives that held a little memorial service for him called Mother and Child. And as I said previously, sort of walking around St Ives, there are her sculptures sort of dotted around, and it's just amazing to think that these things would go for millions and millions of pounds at auctions now, and they would have gone for quite a fair bit in her day as well. But she was just so generous. St Ives was her home, and she was happy to help develop and include public sculptures within her hometown, which I think is really generous of an artist. And she did donate these works as well, which is a really important thing to note. Now, got a little bit distracted there. What I found particularly interesting about the studio, it was kind of like almost walking through a sanctuary. This sort of it was so peaceful and so interesting to see. As I've said previously, it's kind of like she's just popped out to the shops and she's going to be back to like work on something. You can see the traditional tools, the oils that were used to treat, the marble and the wood and all sorts of things like that. And then at the back of the sculpture garden, again glass fronted so you can peer in, is a studio where she would mark out her molds for casting. I just found it so interesting, and there's lots of bits of marble that she's started working on, where you can see that she's physically drawn on where she wants to work into, and in her vision where she's thinking this marble would go, which is just a great insight to see how people, particularly how artists, mark up their materials and their process of thinking and working. And it's the same in her little section of her woodwork studio. All her tools are laid out, and there's works that again have been left unfinished. It's a really, really special place, and I spent a lot of time in the garden, and it's by no means massive. I mean, the garden is so much bigger, and the garden was very important to Hepworth, and she worked outside as much as she possibly could. She preferred being in the open elements and working. But it was here, like I said, her career kind of catapulted. So she actually ended up buying, and I think in the 1960s, she purchased or rented out an old cinema, or a space that used to be an old cinema, and she turned it into an even bigger workshop. So she had 2 huge workshops in this little tiny town. And it was in the bigger studio that used to be the theatre or the cinema that she then began casting and creating all these incredible monumental things that sort of went out and went all over the world. And I would say, if you have never heard of the studio, please do Google it and have a look at the images that I'll put up alongside on my highlights reel. A lot of the images I have taken myself. For me, when I moved through, I didn't really actually want to leave the gardens, and they were very good at like letting people sort of sit down and sketch the works. What I loved about the garden as well is that you could touch the works as well. So you normally in these sort of museum environments, it's very sort of, you have to hold back, but because they're bronze, they're incredibly tactile, beautiful things. And the staff, perhaps it was just that day, I don't know, we were allowed to sort of touch them and interact with them, and as you went round, which I just found so beautiful. There was also a little shed there which had a bed in it, and I assume that is where Hepworth used to sleep sometimes. What's important to note here, and I have touched on it ever so slightly, is that this is the studio where Hepworth died, and she died in 1975, and very tragically actually, she died in an accident, and it was an accident in her studio. And essentially what happened is she fell asleep while smoking a cigarette. I'm not too sure if she was drunk, but she essentially fell asleep while smoking a cigarette, and the cigarette started a fire and she died in the fire. So a really, really tragic end to one of the greatest artists that has ever graced British soil. But she, in her will, had stated that she wanted her St Ives studio to be turned into a museum and sculpture garden, which died in 1975, as I said. The museum and gallery opened to the public in 1976, so they were very quick on her uptake of her wishes in her will. When the gardens and museum opened to the public in 1976, it was run by her estate, run by her daughters, who actually still run the Hepworth estate. But in 1980, they handed it over to the care and protection of Tate. And since 1980, Tate have run and operated the sculpture garden and museum in St Ives. And they've done a really beautiful job. Again, as I've said previously, it's just like she's popped out. It's how she's left it. Of course, they've brought in a few more sculptures and have set it out in a way so visitors can interact and see her beautiful works. And it underwent a huge restoration in 2017, and it was shut, I think, for about a year, and it reopened to the public. So it was kind of on my bucket list in terms of I wanted to visit St Ives just to see why it's inspired so many great artists. And there's an art historian that I really like called Michael Bird, and he very much specialises in post-war British artists and has a love and fascination with the St Ives artists, because like I said, there was this amazing little colony of artists that just sort of appeared in this town, and it kept attracting people. And there's a great creativity that comes out of Cornwall in general, but St Ives is a very, very special place. And even to get there, you have to take a single track train that goes along the coast, and it's just the most beautiful, special place. You kind of feel like you're in Spain almost, or you've fallen down the rabbit hole somehow. It's this incredible, incredible little place, and I would thoroughly recommend that anyone, art historian or not, should make a visit. I wouldn't say stay there. It's incredibly expensive to stay there. I stayed in another town further along the coast, which was about a 30-minute train journey in. But apparently, what I read when I was down there is the train journey into St Ives is one of the most beautiful train journeys in the world. I would thoroughly second that point of view. It's just the most beautiful little entry into this incredible town that's just packed full of art and people on the day that I went. I was really lucky, I think, when the day that I went, because it was so hot, everyone wanted to go to the beach. So I actually, in the garden, it was relatively quiet. People were very chatty when I was asking them like what they were drawing and had they been before, because I'm Scottish and I can't not talk to people when I go anywhere. And it was just something, when I left, I was like, it was really special. So, fun fact about Hepworth, she's actually the namesake of two museums in the UK. So, the Hepworth Museum and Sculpture Garden in St Ives. But in 2011, they opened the Hepworth Museum in Wakefield, which champions sculpture in all its forms. It, of course, has an incredible collection of Barbara Hepworth works, which are always on display. But they run a very interesting programme, and I would definitely say have a little Google. And it also won a RIBA Architecture Award, actually. And they run lots of workshops. They do a lot for the community, and Wakefield is very much an up-and-coming spot in Yorkshire. So I would definitely say check it out and see what's been happening there. The Hepworth Wakefield, much like everywhere else in the UK, of course, had to shut due to COVID in 2020 and reopened in 2021, marking their 10th anniversary with a monumental exhibition entitled Art and Life, which I'll leave a link to below in the show notes. It also was paired up with Google Arts and Culture, so there's a digital exhibition, and there was a brand new publication released of the same title. Now, Hepworth now goes for absolutely bonkers money, but if you're interested at all in the estate, I will leave a link to the estate's links below. There's a lot of information on there. It's incredibly useful, and the estate is actually represented by the New Arts Centre in Wiltshire, which is also known as Roach Court, which is this amazingly beautiful gallery which is housed in, I believe, what used to be or was supposed to be Lord Nelson's ancestral or new home that he'd built, and he was going to retire there and obviously never made it, so it was bought and turned into someone's house, of course, but they run an art gallery out of it, which is a really beautiful space. So if you're a sculpture fan as well and haven't heard of the New Art Centre in Wiltshire, I would definitely say give it a Google, because as well as championing Barbara Hepworth and her estate, they also show just the most beautiful, beautiful selection of sculptors, both past and present. So it's a really special place, and if you're ever in the UK, I would say there's plenty of places to visit, but St Ives is one, New Art Centre is another, if you're a sculpture lover. So this kind of brings me on to my final point of the podcast, which is, would I recommend going to St Ives? Absolutely. I think you would be very surprised if you got to the end of this and I was like, no, it was rubbish, don't go. It was just the most beautiful place. I would suggest that you do not go during high tide of I would suggest that you do not go during peak holiday season if you can avoid it. I have spoken to people previously who say they only go to St Ives in sort of September, October, when it's slightly colder and there's less people there, because you can enjoy it a little bit more. But it was just the most beautiful day, and it's somewhere you can do in a day. It's definitely somewhere you can do in a day. You can do the Tate there. There's a lot of pottery studios that are based out there. You can do some of them, a lot of galleries, as I said. Again, they're all very much on 2 or 3 streets. You can pack a lot into a day. But I would definitely say, if you're a fan of Hepworth's work and really want to understand how she ticked and what inspired her, to walk the landscape and see what inspired her really helps you connect to her as an artist. I think as an art historian and as someone who works with artists day in, day out, it always helps me understand an artist when I go and see where they work and where they live. And it just helps me understand why they tick the way that they do and why they create the way that they do. And there's plenty of fabulous materials of interviews from Hepworth, books about Hepworth, and I would say if this has inspired you to go and check out her work, I definitely would do so. There was a great retrospective actually in 2015 that the Tate put on, which is, I think, one of, if not the most monumental overview of her work to date. And there's an exhibition catalogue for that as well, which I don't personally own, but there is an exhibition catalogue out there. And I did get to visit that show. I moved to London in 2014, and in 2015 there seems to always be one exhibition every year in London that a museum sort of goes all out on their marketing campaign, and in 2015 it was Barbara Hepworth. Although I must say, when I walked through the Hepworth exhibition at Tate in 2015, it was kind of like Hepworth and Friends, because there was about 2 rooms dedicated to Ben Nicholson. But as I said right at the start of the podcast, Ben Nicholson, who was her second husband, he very much inspired her as she did him, and a lot of their works are very, very similar. So I think it would have been ignorant of them not to sort of tip the cap to Ben Nicholson. Did I think he deserved a room and a half, 2 rooms? No, I didn't. But her works were just so fabulous and just great to see, particularly her woodworks and these. Oh God, she's just brilliant. And I really hope this has inspired you to go away and learn a little bit more about her and her studio. And there you have it, the end of another episode of Jo's Art History podcast. Something a little bit different today. I really hope you enjoyed my views and opinions of walking through Barbara Hepworth's museum and sculpture garden in St Ives. For me, it was a really special experience. Like I said, it was like my 30th birthday present to myself. And I think in terms of birthday presents, yeah, it was a pretty great one. It's something that will stay with me forever. It's a really special place, St Ives in general, but to walk the landscape and see what inspired Hepworth and really understand how she ticks and where she created really just gave me a new appreciation to the scale in which her creativity spans and how her creativity continues to inspire generations of sculptors and artists and art historians. For me, she is somebody who there's a lot of hype around, and I genuinely believe rightly so. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to like, rate and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. You can now also leave a review if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify. It would be brilliant if you could leave a review. This podcast takes a lot of time and effort to put together, and to leave a review costs you absolutely nothing but means the absolute world to me. If you've enjoyed listening to this and have thought of someone that might benefit from listening to, please do feel free to pass it on. It would be great to get more people listening to the podcast. Also, if you are a fan of Hepworth and you've been to the Sculpture Garden, you've been to Wakefield, or even if you are a fan and haven't been, I'd love to hear from you. What do you love about her? What do you hate about her? Also, if anyone's listening that wants to come on and do a little bit more of an in-depth dive into her artwork, her history, please feel free to get in touch. I would love to have you on as a guest. Now, I haven't really mentioned any images in this podcast. However, I will put a selection of images that I took personally while I visited the Sculpture Garden up on my Instagram highlights reel. If you'd like to get in touch and discuss anything you heard today, please feel free. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com. or you can DM me on Instagram at Joe's Art History. If you'd like to give me a follow on Instagram as well, that would be great. I don't just post about the podcast, I post about other things as well. I have lots of different series and things that I do month on month. Finally, I've been Jo McLaughlin, your host and resident art historian here on Joe's Art History podcast, and thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to welcome you next time on Joe's Art History podcast. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art is for all. Bye.